Okay. I can do this, right? It's just time travel. No big deal. I beat the impossible here before, and I can make it happen again. If only I knew how I did it the first couple of times. Hey, you're ahead of me on the timeline. You can give me hints if I'm getting close, right? Is that a no? Let's get to it. Who doesn't love a good time travel story, where the main characters bend the laws of the universe to their will? At a glance, the genre of time travel seems like a pretty straightforward subgenre of science fiction. But once you start getting into it, you'll find that time travel is one of the most diverse and complicated premises you can have. There is a huge variety with what you can do with time travel as a concept, and countless stories out there with completely unique takes on it. For this video, I'd like to give an overview of the entirety of fictional time travel. We'll compare and contrast lots of different stories to see what commonalities they have, so that we can better understand how they're written. I'm hoping that by the end of this, we'll have figured out something new about how the genre operates. And the sooner the better. A lot of people point to A Christmas Carol as one of the earliest time travel stories. You know, the three ghosts take Scrooge to visit his past, present, and future. I don't really buy that, especially when considering the modern conception of time travel. Scrooge isn't really going to these times, he's just looking at them. And the story makes no real claim that the future scenario is actually going to happen. The whole story is more like a philosophical overview of one man's life than a true time travel plot. If we narrow the definition a bit, we can say that time travel is when a person's physical form is transported to and interacts with the past and/or future. In that case, most sources will tell you that the first time travel story ever is The Clock That Went Backwards by Edward Page Mitchell in 1881. It's about a magical clock that sends some people to the past and back again. But the originator, the codifier of time travel as we know it today, is The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. This is also where we get the term time machine. H.G. Wells invented a lot of staples of the sci-fi genre, but this might be his biggest contribution. Since then, time travel has exploded as a genre, with countless stories exploring the concept. I've seen a lot of fictional time travel in my life, and if there's one thing I know, it's this. Time travel makes no sense. I mean it. There are virtually no time travel stories that hold up under logical scrutiny. The act of moving around in time like this causes a breakdown in the very concept of logic, because it totally messes up the idea of cause and effect. For a specific fictional example, we have Terminator. In the future, John Connor sends Kyle Reese to the present to protect his mother, Sarah Connor, from the Terminator. But then, Kyle Reese and Sarah Connor,
got busy!
And Sarah ends up pregnant with John. So that means John sent his father back in time. But wait, John Connor was born because Kyle Reese was sent back in time by John Connor. So John Connor caused his own birth? How is that possible? The answer is, it's not. Impossible scenarios like this pop up all across time travel fiction. Let's talk about paradoxes. The definition of a paradox is that it's a logical impossibility, but they're a staple of the time travel genre. Abandon all logic, ye who enter here. There are two main types of time travel paradoxes you tend to see. The first is the grandfather paradox. You've all heard this one. If I go back in time and kill my grandfather, that will mean I'll never exist, which means I won't be able to go back in time and kill my grandfather. More broadly, when you go back in time, it's very easy to interrupt the flow of events that allowed you to time travel in the first place. This kind of issue is all over fictional time travel. There's a reason why it's so common, and that's because it's so easy to do. The grandfather paradox is closely related to another time travel concept called the butterfly effect. The butterfly effect is the idea that something as small as a butterfly flapping its wings can cause huge ripple effects into the future. So with any time travel into the past, even the tiniest actions can change the present. Maybe you're not very likely to kill your own grandfather or cause your own birth, but who knows what you can end up changing just by being there, taking steps and breathing the air.
Don't do anything, don't touch anything. Sci-fi rule number 1. You start messing with the past, you end up with monkeys ruling the future.
The other major kind of paradox is the Bootstrap Paradox. This is when an object is created through time travel that has no origin. I could take a copy of Romeo and Juliet and bring it back to Shakespeare, who could then print it and sell it. But if I did that, who wrote Romeo and Juliet? Shakespeare didn't write it, he got it from me. I didn't write it, I got it from Shakespeare. A pretty much identical example shows up in Back to the Future. Marty McFly goes back in time and plays Johnny Be Good by Chuck Berry. Then Chuck Berry hears about the song and copies it.
Chuck, it's Marvin!
wasn't Marvin Berry. You know that new sound you looking for? Well, listen to this.
So then, who wrote the song? It's so easy for this kind of thing to happen when you break the chain of cause and effect. We're used to events happening in order, with one leading to the next in a sort of never-ending domino chain. But time travel reorders things, so that you can't determine what originally caused an event. This is why it's so easy to make a bad time travel story. Fiction thrives on cause and effect. We want to see those chains of events in our stories. We need to know that there's a reason why things are happening. But too many time travel shenanigans can make it so that nothing makes sense, making everything meaningless and killing audience investment. There are generally two ways to handle this. The first is to establish extremely clear and specific rules for how time travel works in this particular story. That way, even when the order of events gets all tangled up, the audience can still follow the why and how of what's going on. The Missing book series by Margaret Peterson Haddix is a great example of this. It has some really complex laws of time travel that I've never seen anywhere else. For example, if too many people mess around with one spot in the timeline, they can end up damaging it so that no one can travel to that era again. This whole setting up rules thing is harder to pull off than it sounds, though. If there are too many rules, they can slow down the plot and suck the fun out. The other approach you can take is to say, who cares about rules, let's do whatever. After all, if time travel basically never ends up making sense, why bother trying to keep it logical?
You step on a butterfly, you change the future of the human race.
Tell you what then, don't step on any butterflies. What have butterflies ever done to you?
Time travel stories that ignore any and all big consequences of time travel are pretty common. They just have characters running around in the past and the future doing whatever they want. But wait, didn't I just say a minute ago that when time travel gets too illogical, the audience loses investment because everything becomes meaningless? Well, it depends on the kind of story you're trying to tell. Are you familiar with Brandon Sanderson? If not, he's a very popular fantasy author who's known for creating complex rules and mechanics for magic in his books. He has these 3 laws of magic to explain how to write stories that use magic. Distilling the art of storytelling down to clear and discrete laws. A man after my own heart. Sanderson's first law states that an author's ability to solve conflict with magic is directly proportional to how well the reader understands said magic. What does that mean? Well, we like to see characters succeed by figuring out interesting ways to solve problems. A fictional character can use magic to get out of a jam, but only if the magic has clear rules and limitations. That way, magic becomes another tool that the character can find a clever way to use in a satisfying way. But if the rules of the magic are vague, then using it to zap the problem away will feel like a lame cop-out. The same thing applies to time travel. If there are clear mechanics for how time travel works, then the characters can use it to solve problems in creative ways. But, if the rules of time travel aren't clearly defined, then the story needs to have another source of tension. See, a lot of the time, the point of a time travel story isn't time travel. The point is to create a fun situation for telling a story. Sometimes all a story wants to do is drop the characters into a fun and weird setting in the past or the future to mess around in. In stories like that, we're not supposed to sit there going, but what about the timeline and butterfly effects? We're just supposed to enjoy the character development, or the situational comedy, or whatever the focus is on besides time travel. Does anybody watch Hot Tub Time Machine because they want to see realistic physics? No. Anything goes as long as the end result is funny.
I suggest you don't worry about this sort of thing and just enjoy yourself. That goes for you all, too.
Yes.
Let's look at Back to the Future again. When Marty McFly goes back to the 50s and accidentally stops his parents from meeting, that prevents him from ever being born. So he starts to disappear. Slowly. This makes no sense. Realistically, this would be instantaneous, right? But that doesn't matter. The point of this movie is to watch a teen from the 80s stumble around an unfamiliar environment, and for him to better understand his parents' relationship. He doesn't solve the problem by time traveling, he solves it by getting to know his parents better and helping all 3 of them grow as people. That's the heart of the story. Did that do it? Man, that was all I had planned out. Okay, no big deal. Just gotta keep it going. I'll be right back. Time travel comes in a lot of different flavors. Next, why don't I try listing every form of fictional time travel I can think of, ordered from least to most complex. First up, the ones that barely count as time travel. Way at the simple end of things, you have stories where characters get cryogenically frozen and wake up in the future. Time is still passing normally, but this allows for characters to skip ahead to a new time. Next, time dilation. This is the only type of time travel that's actually possible in real life. It's weird to put this as one of the simpler examples since it involves some pretty complicated real-life physics, but compared to stories with multiple timelines, this is a cakewalk to understand. When an object goes really fast, like close to the speed of light fast, time actually speeds up around it. Again, this is real. If you got in a super fast rocket and flew around in circles for a while, you could make it so that years went by on Earth even though it only felt like a few minutes to you. Lots of hard sci-fi stories have characters do this to give time a fast forward button. This isn't really time travel in the way that we think of it though, it only works one way. Then there's the time freeze, a story where a character can stop and start time at will. They pause the world around them and then mess around while everything is frozen. Time is still linear here, so we're still not into complicated timelines territory yet. Now let's talk about some ways of actually bouncing around in time. Next, your standard time loop, sometimes called the Groundhog Day loop, named after the most famous example, Groundhog Day. A character is stuck repeating a certain section of time over and over. Once they hit a certain point, time resets and they jump back to the beginning. This continues ad infinitum until the loop is broken. The last run of the loop is the only one with lasting consequences on the world. But that doesn't mean that the other loops don't matter, because the main character remembers them. This experience has changed them, and the breaking of the time loop usually coincides with the end of their character arc. A close relative of the time loop is the do-over. This is a story where the character has some kind of ability to rewind time and jump back to an earlier point. It works a lot like dying in a video game and then going back to where you last saved. This can get more complicated than a regular time loop because the character can control it, but it ends up being pretty easy to follow since by the end there's only one final linear timeline. The obvious appeal of all these kinds of stories is to experience life without consequences. You can undo any mistake just by rewinding to before you made it. The next one is something I'll call time travel tourism. This is when the main characters pop over to another place in time, have an adventure, and then go home without much of a lasting impact on the time stream. The point of this kind of time travel plot is to explore a fun setting, and these stories aren't really concerned with the potential dangers of changing history. There are a lot of kids media that do this kind of thing for educational purposes, like the Magic School Bus. But that doesn't mean a story like this can't have big stakes. Those stakes just aren't tied to the mechanics of time travel. It's the Sanderson law again. But now, we get to my personal favorite way to handle time travel. A closed loop. Closed loop time travel follows what's called the Novikov self-consistency principle, which is the idea that no time travel can ever change the past, because any repercussions of their actions in the past are already being felt in the present. In a closed loop, there is one consistent timeline that can never be changed. Nobody who goes back in time can ever change that, and a lot of the time they end up causing things to happen the way that they did. Even better, there are a lot of stories where characters go back in time to stop something bad from happening, only to discover that they were the ones that caused it in the first place. This is the only form of time travel that holds up logically. The Novikov principle isn't a fictional thing, it's a real scientific way to think about time travel in the real world. Time travel in fiction is allowed to not make sense because it's all made up, but I think it's the coolest when a story makes rules like this work. It's so satisfying to see everything fall into place, like fate. I can't get enough of that. Then we have time travel that isn't actually time travel, but is really just hopping between alternate dimensions. Because of pop culture, we're all generally familiar with the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, or at least the cartoony Hollywood version of it. Under this idea, every time we make a decision, time splits, creating one universe where we made one choice, and one universe where we made the other choice. This creates an infinite number of universes where anything can have happened. When fictional characters travel the multiverse, they're not really traveling forward or backward in time, but this does show us the full extent of the butterfly effect. The littlest changes can lead to completely new worlds. But here's when things start to get a little messy. This is definitely the broadest and least defined category, but in a nutshell, these are stories where a character can go back in time and do something, resulting in a change in the present, or where a character comes to the present from the future in order to change the future. Finally, we have time travel that really does change the future. And that means chaos. It means paradoxes. It means the butterfly effect is in full swing. The most common structure of a story like this is for a character to go back to the past, change something, and then come back to the present only to find that they made things way worse. So then they go to the past again, undo what they did, and put everything back to normal. When these stories involve changing the past to affect the present, they usually end with everything going back to normal. The lesson is always, don't mess with fate. You can't undo your mistakes. But if it's someone coming from the future to visit the main characters in the present, they usually succeed in changing the future. For whatever reason, even when we know the future, it's still more malleable than the past. Next, I'll throw in a pretty uncommon one, but it's too weird and interesting to ignore. Stories where characters go backwards in time. as in time travels linearly, but in the opposite direction. This kind of thing can very quickly melt your brain trying to imagine. And finally, we end with the biggest and messiest time travel stories of all. There isn't really one concise way to group all of these. As we've established, time travel is confusing by default, and all the previous categories exist as ways to keep it organized. These stories are what happen when the writer goes buck wild with it. Characters can go to the past, the future, the past again, then the present, change the future, go back and meet themselves, and create a paradox that blows up the time stream and resets everything. Past, present, and future events are constantly in flux. Anything goes. With stories like these, maybe it's well thought out, and maybe it all makes sense if you're willing to put in the work, but usually it's better if you just try not to think about it too hard. Those are all the kinds of time travel I can think of. They can all be cool in their own ways, but like I said, I prefer closed loops. No paradoxes, no mess, just a satisfyingly logical time travel. I'm no scientist, but I think that if time travel were real, this is how it would work, don't you think? Except wait, Terminator is a closed loop, and Terminator is full of paradoxes. Now that I'm thinking about it, there are tons of closed loop stories that create bootstrap paradoxes that make it impossible to figure out how the closed loop got that way in the first place. And I thought I had it. What is all this then? Something else about time travel stories that I'm curious about is the source. Typically, time travel is science-based. Somebody invents a machine that travels in time. But time travel can also be magic-based. Someone or something is granted the ability to time travel. Those are cool. Functionally, these are the same, but they communicate different messages and themes. With science, there's usually a level of arrogance for the characters, that if they're brilliant enough to invent time travel, they can handle its consequences, which ends up getting them into a lot of trouble. With magical time travel, it's been gifted. Either the characters had this ability for a while and they're completely comfortable with it, or it's just dropped on them and they're completely overwhelmed. And overlapping between the two, it's worth mentioning stories where characters are given time travel by more advanced beings. My favorite example of this is Arrival. It's about these aliens that don't experience time linearly, and by interacting with human characters, it's given them the ability to see their entire lives at once. In a story like that, though, there isn't any actual time travel. Characters aren't going into the future, they can just see their future. It's like fate, or a prophecy. Wait a minute. Prophecies are time travel. Prophecies are time travel! What's a prophecy? A look into the future. Even if the characters aren't physically moving around in time, this is still time travel. It's just information that's traveling. Any story with a prophecy, Greek tragedies, Shakespeare, Harry Potter even, is a closed-loop time travel story. Think about this. What happens every time a fictional character hears a prophecy about themselves? They try to avoid their fate. They hear something about their future that they don't like, and they try to stop it. But then what always happens? They fail. Or even end up causing the prophecy to come true by trying to avoid it. Because the timeline is already written. Any attempts to change these events have already affected the timeline. It's a closed loop. This is functionally no different from somebody physically traveling to the past to stop something from happening and then accidentally causing it. But then, wouldn't that create a paradox? Say a character hears a prophecy they don't like. Because of that, they try to stop it. But because they try to stop it, they accidentally cause it to happen. Because they cause it to happen, that's what happens, and then the prophecy predicts it. The prophecy caused its own origin. If it had never been made, then the thing it describes never would have happened. It's another Bootstrap Paradox. Or is it? I've been talking like closed-loop time travel takes place on one uninterrupted timeline. But what if that's not the case? What if there are other timelines that we don't see? I'm rambling, hold on. To show you what I'm getting at, let me take the most famous self-fulfilling prophecy of all time as an example. Oedipus. The Oracle of Delphi predicted that Oedipus would marry his mother. That made Oedipus run away from his parents. But it turns out that Oedipus was just adopted and didn't know it. So he runs away, meets another woman, and marries her, who turns out to be his biological mother. That's a paradox, right? If the Oracle had never made the prophecy about this happening, then this never would have happened. But what if this would have happened whether there was a prophecy or not? What if, without the prophecy, Oedipus would have just married his mother for other reasons? And when the Oracle looks into the future, this timeline is what she sees. When she tells Oedipus of this future event, this sends Oedipus on a new trajectory where he tries not to marry his mom. This timeline is erased, creating a new timeline where Oedipus still marries his mom, just for different reasons. The prophecy didn't change the event, it just changed how it happened. Then the Oracle still looks into the future and sees Oedipus marrying his mom, and makes the same prophecy that leads to the same timeline where Oedipus marries his mom. And now we have our closed loop. We've solved the Bootstrap Paradox. The prophecy doesn't have no origin, it just has an origin in another timeline. It's like dropping a rock into a lake. You can disrupt the time stream causing ripples, but those ripples eventually resolve themselves. This also explains why prophecies are almost always really vague and unhelpful. From a logical and mechanical perspective, too much detail would make it too easy for a person to avoid the events they hear about, making the prophecy impossible. From a story and writing perspective, telling the reader exactly what happens in the future deflates all the tension. There needs to be some kind of unknown. If not in the specific events, then how they happen. In short, too much detail in a prophecy would make it too easy for a character to avoid it, which would then ensure that the prophecy would never be made. This means that any closed-loop timeline still has echoes of other possible futures in it. Characters take actions based on information that they ultimately got from another version of the future. How do you avoid a paradox when you talk to your past self? You make sure that when it's the past self's turn to be the future self, you make sure that they say and do everything in exactly the same way that you did it. You don't even know what we're running from, do you? You're just copying what you think you're supposed to be doing based on the first go-round. Because that's what worked. Wow. I guess I just figured out time travel? Did any of that rambling make sense to anybody else? If not, well, it made sense to me, and that's all I really needed. So I can just kick back and relax now, right? But I don't feel any different. Uh-oh. This is the end, isn't it? I failed. Time travel. Why did I think time travel would get me out of this? You know what a closed-loop timeline is? A safe, secure little bubble where everything is predictable and nothing ever changes. I would love to be living in a world like that instead of whatever this is. Don't come in here. No! Go away. Leave me alone. Leave me alone. Leave me alone.